Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Randy Shriver. I'm the president of the Project 2049 Institute. And I want to thank you for joining us today. According to a New York Times story earlier this year, a party directive went out in China stating that students should become more patriotic, more devoted to the party, and be aware of Western influences creating negativity about China's party's history. There was a follow-up New York Times story more recently this month talking about the Ministry of Education's plan to have 200 million students returning to school who are required to watch a new film about the Long March, and that schools and educational institutions should be promoting the Long March spirit in China. We've seen recent reporting about celebrations of Mao's life. Recently, we noted the 40th anniversary of his passing, and there were celebrations and memorials. And we've seen party and government officials promoting this idea more and more about hostile forces trying to impact China's history. China's education minister, Yuan Gui-ren, recently said that more oversight is needed on textbooks and professors because they are targets of Western hostile forces trying to impact China's history. So what concern is this of ours? This is China's own history, after all. Well, I subscribe to the notion that if it's important to the Chinese, it's at least important for us to understand why it's important to them and why they pay so much attention and devote so much focus to the historical narratives and their record. We know it's important to them because not only the things I cited that have been reported on recently, you can walk through the official history museum on Tiananmen Square, the official history of the Communist Party of China, and you can see some very significant gaps. There are portraits of all the general secretaries of the Communist Party. There's no portrait for Zhao Ziyang. There's no placard for the Cultural Revolution. There's very little mention of the Great Leap Forward. So if they're going to these efforts, you understand that it's important to them, but they've also said it's important. We certainly heard a lot last year during the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II about the Chinese view that it's important for other countries, mostly from their perspective directed at our Japanese allies, that historical accuracy, facing history honestly is important because it affects events today. So I subscribe to this, that it's important for us to understand because they see it as important. But I think beyond that, historical narratives help shape identity. Identity helps shape the people's view of where they sit in the world, in the region, and ultimately this informs and impacts external behavior. And so if for no other reason, I think we need to understand what it is about education, about culture, about media, about these historical narratives that China is promoting that drive external behavior that we are all dealing with now in the Asia-Pacific region. So I think we have a great group of folks, a great lineup to help us explore these topics. And I'm particularly excited about our first speaker, and I will allow my colleague, Rachel Burton, to take over the floor and introduce the first panel. So thank you again for joining us. And Rachel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Randy. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. The phrase, "seek truth from facts," was introduced to the People's Republic of China as a hallmark slogan of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party. However, to seek truth from facts has tragically resulted in the revision of history, human dignity, and the pursuit of adherence to the party. So I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Endo. And Dr. Endo was born in China in 1941 and lived through the Chinese Revolutionary War and returned to Japan in 1953. She is a Doctor of Science, Director of the Center of International Relations at Tokyo University and the Graduate School of Social Welfare, and Professor Emeritus at the University of Tsukuba. Excuse me if I misspoke that. She was also a visiting researcher and professor at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. So without further ado, Dr. Endo.
Thank you, Ms. Chairperson, Rachel Burton, and Project 2049 for giving me this wonderful opportunity. And hello, everyone. My name is Homare Endo. It's my great honor to have the chance to speak at this conference today. I was born in China in 1941, and after receiving an education in Maoism, I moved to Japan in 1953. So my native language is Chinese. But in Japan, I only use Japanese and sometimes Chinese on a daily basis, so my English is not fluent. But today, I'd like to try to speak in English, so please forgive my poor pronunciation. Now, let's begin with the PowerPoint. Okay. When I was 7 years old, I experienced the Chinese Civil War after the defeat of Japan, and the city Changchun, where I lived, was wholly surrounded with barbed wire by the Communist Army for nearly 1 year. The blockade led to the starvation of hundreds of thousands of Chinese people in 1948. I still remember the feeling of sleeping on the ground alongside numerous dead bodies. In the hope of putting the spirits of the victims to rest, I published the book entitled Earth Without Exist in 1984 in Japanese. I sincerely wanted to have this book published in mainland China in Chinese and made my best efforts to achieve this over the last 30 years, but in vain. The restrictions on freedom of speech in China are simply too severe. I could only publish the Chinese version, 家子没有出口的大地, in Taiwan, and the English version in the United States, Japanese Girl at the siege of Changchun, How I Survived China's Wartime Atrocity. The main aim of the Chinese government's controls of freedom of speech is, of course, to maintain the single-party rule. But we cannot overlook the terrifying secrets hidden behind these controls. It's a fact that Mao Zedong, the founding father of the People's Republic of China, conspired with the Japanese army during the Sino-Japanese War. Mao's single purpose was to weaken the military power of the Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, or KMT, led by Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang Jieshi. Mao sent many communist spies to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan and the Japanese army to give them military intelligence about the Chinese Nationalist Party. This intelligence was obtained at the Central National Government in Chongqing by cooperation between the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party, and was sold for high price to the Japanese side. Recently, I found detailed evidence based on Japanese insider information and revealed the behavior of Mao during the Sino-Japanese War. By comparing the materials in Japan with those in China, I published in Japan last year a book titled 毛沢東、日本軍と共謀した男, Mao Zedong, the man who conspired with the Japanese army. And recently, I published the Chinese version, 毛泽东勾结日军的真相, with the Mira Media Group in New York. The English version is currently being translated. Now, let me share with you several points from my findings. The biggest cache of evidence in Japan is the memoirs written by Mr. Iwai Eiichi. Almost all the communist spies made contact with Mr. Iwai at the so-called Iwai official residence in Shanghai, one of the organizations of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan. The name of the most well-known communist spy was Pan Han-nian. This name Pan Han-nian appears very frequently in the book Kaisou no Shanghai, Memoirs in Shanghai, written by Iwai. This book, this one. I also investigated declassified insider intelligence recorded during the Sino-Japanese War, kept in the diplomatic archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan. For example, this one, this kind. This is the first time these documents have been shown in the original form. Would you please look at the correlation map, conspiracy between communist spies and the Japanese army? The left-hand side of the map lists the key members of Mao's spy operation and their chain of command. On the right-hand side of the map, the organization of Japanese side is shown, with which the communist spies made contact. In 1939, Mao ordered Pan to infiltrate the Iwai official residence. One day, Iwai was very surprised to hear an offer from Pan. Pan said to Iwai, "We, the Communist Army, want to make a ceasefire with the Japanese army." In response to Pan's request for ceasefire, Iwai introduced him to the staff officer of the Japanese army. Pan went to the top military advisory office of the Nanjing government and met Major General Kagesa of the Japanese army. Through an introduction made by General Kagesa, Pan met the top leader, Wang Jingwei, of the Nanjing government, which was the puppet government of Japan. In addition to conspiring with the Japanese army, Mao sought to collude with the Japanese-controlled Nanjing puppet government and ordered Pan to negotiate. Mao's key motive in this endeavor was to leave the fight against Japan to Chiang Kai-shek and to concentrate on building the might of his own communist army. In 1955, 6 years after the birth of the People's Republic of China, Pan and subsequently nearly 1,000 other communist spies were arrested, jailed, and silenced. They knew too much. After Mao's death, there were many biographies published in mainland China about Pan, who perished in prison. Among these biographies, the following description can be found. Pan received a monthly payment of 2,000 Hong Kong yuan from Iwai for the provision of intelligence and a payment of 10,000 Hong Kong yuan for publishing magazines on an irregular basis. At that time, these payments were equal to several hundreds years' salary for a Hong Kong public servant in total. Most of this was spent on generating publicity, which played a role in winning the hearts of the people and attracting them to the CCP. It is especially noteworthy that Mao, through his life, neither held a celebration of victory for the Sino-Japanese War, nor permitted writing about the Nanjing Massacre in school textbooks. I'd like to share with you several pieces of evidence. This is a chronological list edited by the CCP concerning Mao's life from his birth to death. This is a series of books in 9 volumes. This one, this is one of them. It is surprising that on Victory Day in 1950, the first day after the birth of China, there is no record of Mao's action regarding Victory Day. The first entry appears on September 2nd, 1951. And on that day, Mao only sent a telegram of congratulation to Joseph Stalin, who was the top leader of the former Soviet Union. On September 3rd, Victory Day, Mao did nothing about the victory ceremony. He spent the day in his private chambers checking documents concerning Tibet and discussing other domestic matters. On Victory Day in 1952, Mao did almost the same thing. On September 2nd, in 1953, Mao sent a telegram to the new leader of the Soviet Union following Stalin's death in March of that year. Moreover, the contents of this telegram were mainly about the Korean War Truce Treaty. On Victory Day, September 3rd, Mao did nothing once again. After 1955, he completely ignored Victory Day. For him, the celebration of this victory would have only served to congratulate Stalin or Chiang Kai-shek, who had actually fought against Japan. Mao himself knew the truth. On the day of the Nanjing Massacre, December 13th, 1937, only 4 kanji characters, Nanjing Shi Xian, appear in the record. These 4 characters, Nanjing Shi Xian, mean that Nanjing has fallen. The word massacre is not present. And we can't find any description about so-called Nanjing hereafter. I'd like to share with you the entries after the birth of the People's Republic of China. Please look at the right-hand side of this picture. On December 13th, there is no entry. Like this, Mao completely ignored the Nanjing Massacre throughout his life. We can interpret these 2 symbolic facts to mean that Mao didn't want people to know the following. That is, it was not the Communist Army, but the Nationalist Army that mainly fought against Japan during the Sino-Japanese War. But after the Tiananmen Square protests in 1989, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, China was forced to emphasize how great the Chinese Communist Party is in order to avoid a chain reaction resulting in the potential collapse of China. As a result, from 1994, China launched a project for patriotic education, which asserts that the Communist Army defeated Japan in the Sino-Japanese War. Last year, for the first time after the foundation, China held a military parade on Anti-Fascism Victory Day. Today, China, which claims to be the champion against fascism, is working on programs to advance its global hegemony in military, economic, and even cultural spheres. The famous scholar of the history of the CCP, Mr. Xing Haolian, he was present at a speech given by former top Chinese leader Hu Yaobang in 1979. According to his testimony, Hu Yaobang said that if someday the Chinese people learn the true history of the CCP, they would overthrow the Chinese government. This is completely consistent with my analysis of Mao Zedong. If someday all the people of China came to know the truth about Mao, the CCP would lose its mandate instantaneously, and the Chinese government would collapse. I believe the people of China are intelligent, and able to comprehend the true history of the CCP. So, for fear of this, China is ramping up its suppression of freedom of speech and denies universal values such as rule of law in an attempt to legitimize their government and one-party rule. Consequently, China will continue to expand its global hegemony in order to strengthen the domestic leadership of the Communist Party. But hegemony without democracy places the future of the world in peril. The so-called history card played by China is not entirely aimed at Japan. The real objective is to weaken the United States, which has a security treaty with Japan. China wants to be the world's greatest superpower in order to maintain one-party rule within China. Finally, as for Japan, I'm definitely against wars of aggression. Japan ought not to repeat such a historical folly. Under this precondition, I hope the Chinese people have the courage to face up to the truth about Mao Zedong. I also hope the international community becomes aware of this truth, which may help us have a better understanding of the world we live in today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Endo, for your presentation and for really a new outlook on the Sino-Japanese War. It's certainly important to recall and track the CCP's commemoration of Victory Day as we compare them to how the party commemorates them today. And as we move forward, I ask Xin Haonian to provide some commentary and remarks. Xin Haonian is a renowned scholar and historian on China. He is the author of the book, Who is the New China, and chief editor of the magazine Huanghua Gang. Previously, he was a former visiting scholar at the East Asia Institute of the University of Toronto and a visiting scholar postdoctoral fellow at the East Asia Institute of Columbia University. So, Xin Haonian.
非常抱歉，为了能够自由地表达，也为了能够将我这个极简短的评价，让我国内的同胞们能够听到，所以我还是讲中文。我特别请李刚博士为我做翻译，谢谢李刚博士。
I apologize that for me to speak freely and also to be able to have my speech being able to be viewed by people, by my fellow Chinese in China. I'd like to give my words in Chinese, and I invited Dr. Li to interpret for me. Thank you, Dr. Li.
我非常感谢远藤裕教授能够请我来评价他这本书。我的，你说。
I thank Professor Endo very much for inviting me to here to give a brief review of her book.
我和远藤裕教授的神交就是通过他写的这本书。
I get to know Professor Endo through this book of hers.
我觉得这本书，首先，它非常公开的、直截了当的承认了20世纪上半期的中日战争是日。
This book had openly and straightforwardly acknowledged that the war happened in the first half of last century. The Sino-Japanese War was an invasion of the Japanese into China.
并且他在书中指出，正是日本帝国对中国的侵略，对中华民国的侵略，才造成了中国现代民主进程的巨大的断崖效应，也就是阻断了中国的民主进程。
And also in the book, she pointed out it was because of this war. The great effect of it was that the Chinese democratic progress was abruptly interrupted by it, and it had totally changed the history of China.
这是我和远藤裕教授友谊的基础，也是我能够愿意来这里评价这本书的根本原因。
This is a foundation of my friendship with Professor Ando, and was also the key reason for me to come here to give my brief review.
远藤裕教授不仅是一个明辨历史是非的历史学者，而且是一个非常非常不势利的历史学家，因为他不像二战以后世界上所有的那些势利的历史学家们那样，也不像美国哈佛的费正清教授一样一辈子助共为虐。
Professor Ando is a scholar, a historian who can tell right from wrong. She does not take sides because of power, not like some other historians in the history, on the history of China, especially Professor Fairbank of Harvard.
他明确地指出，中华民国政府、蒋介石先生和中国国民党，如果不能没有遭遇日本的侵略战争，那么他们是能够把中国带向现代化、民主化的道路上去的，就像今天的台湾一样。
She pointed out clearly and powerfully, without the interruption, without the invasion of the Japanese, the nationalist government led by General Chiang Kai-shek would be able to achieve modernization and democratization in China, just like what they had done in Taiwan.
远藤裕教授在这本书里面特别地指出了中华民国的伟大的抗日救国战争、卫国战争，是蒋介石先生领导的，中华民国政府领导的，是中国国民党领导和坚持的。
In her book, Professor Ando had pointed out the great war of defending China was led by the nationalist government, was led by Chiang Kai-shek. It had 对不起，怎么的？就是最后那，就是没看。
我继续说吧。
Yeah.
远藤裕教授特别指出了，抗日战争的中流砥柱是中华民国南京国民政府和重庆国民政府，而不是中共的延安政府。
And Professor Ando had pointed out the main force, the actual force who was doing the war, who was defending China, was the Nanjing government and the Chongqing government of the Nationalist Party, not the communist government in Yan'an.
远藤裕教授在他的书里面非常清楚明白地指出了，中国共产党及其延安政府在整个抗日战争当中消极抗战、假抗战、不打日寇、专打国军、与日寇勾结等等的出卖民族和国家的行为。
And Professor Ando, in her book, had pointed out that the Communist Party and the Yan'an regime did not actively fight the Japanese. They were playing a passive role, and they were playing a forced role. they were actually in conspiracy with the Japanese to sabotage the warring effort of the nationalist government.
这本书写道，在抗日战争全面抗战没有爆发之前，中共毛泽东和他的党一再的期望中日战争早一天打起来。在抗日战争全面抗战爆发以后，中国共产党希望日本军队能够狠狠地打那个他不承认的祖国中华民国。在抗日战争的过程中，中国共产党又派潘汉年和其他的一些中共干部潜入敌后，勾结日军，甚至让毛泽东与潘汉年单独联系，指使他去向日本报告中国战场的情报，蒋介石领导的抗日战争的情报，和蒋介石和英美等国家盟国共同抗击世界法西斯的情报。他的这些有效的
In her book, Professor Endo had showed evidence that before the eruption of the overall war, the general war, the Communist Party had been wanted the war to start, had been very anxious waiting for the war to start. So, and also after the general war had started, the Communist Party had wanted the Japanese would be able to crush the nationalist government, the Chinese government would be able to help the Communist Party to grow and to get strong. Mao Zedong had sent a top lieutenant, Pan Han-nian, to talk with the Japanese army and to share military intelligence, not only of the nationalist government, but also of the nationalist government's cooperation and coordination with U.S., with the United Kingdoms, and with other allied countries.
特别是他揭露的潘汉年和日本间谍机关严井公馆的关系，以及潘汉年向日本所提供的情报，甚至于让日本在经济上给中共提供资源，像这样一些丑闻，足以将中共延安政府推上抗日战争当中第二个汉奸集团的历史地位。
And especially the evidence Professor Endo had revealed in her book about Pan Han-nian's dealing with the Japanese Japanese intelligence agency Iwai official residence, and Pan Han-nian's sharing of intelligence with the Japanese, and also receiving financial aid from the Japanese. This has all pinned the Communist Party as a very traitorous group, the second biggest traitorous group during the war.
远藤一教授在这本书当中所讲述的内容，和中国大陆从1985年以来31年的历史反思运动、民间历史反思运动所获得的成果是完全一致的。只是由于我们不懂日文，我们很多历史学家没办法去日本看到远藤裕教授所能看到的资料，所以我们不能拿出潘汉年投靠日本作为汉奸出卖祖国情报的罪证。可是远藤裕教授对此做出了最大的贡献，他把这个罪证公之于众了。
And the conclusions of Professor Endo's book are very consistent with the result of Chinese historians, not the official historians, but the historians independent historians, result when they rethink about the Chinese history since 1985, for a 31 years period. However, our problem was that we did not have access to Japanese archives. We did not have access to material in Japanese. What Professor Endo did was to corroborate with our result to show that what the independent historians in China had reached the correct conclusions. And it showed the things that we couldn't have access, such as Pan Hanyan's evidence of Pan Hanyan's criminal cooperation with the Japanese during the war.
1979年的2月，我因为参加全国长篇小说创作座谈会，在北京亲自聆听了胡耀邦先生的一次报告。在这个报告当中，胡耀邦先生曾经捶着桌子说了一句话，叫做“要是让人民知道了我们共产党的历史，人民就要起来推翻我们”。
In February of 1979, I, as an author of for fictionary works, attended a conference. At the conference, the late General Secretary of the Communist Party, Hu Yaobang, gave a speech. And in the speech, Hu Yaobang had admitted that if we let people knew our history, they would overthrow us. They would remove us from the power.
之后，我不仅在胡耀邦先生的2个非常重要的下级干部当中找到了确证，同时，我也想告诉大家，中国大陆人民31年来艰难困苦的民间历史反思运动，和远藤裕教授写的这本书，恰恰证明了胡耀邦先生说的是真话，不是假话。
And later on, I also got more concrete evidence from people below Mr. Hu, and the conclusions that we reached during these 31 years of hard rethinking, of a very difficult rethinking, and the evidence provided by Professor Endo in her book, all had shown what Mr. Hu said at that time was very, very true.
我认为远藤裕教授这本书还有一个特别重大的意义，它在于20世纪上半期的这场中日战争，既然是日本帝国侵略中国的战争，是阻断了中国民主进程的战争，那么当日本国要向中国道歉的时候，他的道歉的对象应该是谁？
And also a very significant meaning of this book is that since the Sino-Japanese War was an invasion of Japan to China, and it interrupted the progress of China toward democracy. In that sense, if someone wants to apologize, who should they apologize to?
他的道歉对象，毫无疑问的是蒋介石先生，我们的民族英雄蒋介石先生；毫无疑问的是中华民国南京政府和重庆政府；毫无疑问的是遭受了侵略的中国大陆人民，也就是中华民国的大陆国民。所以，我想说的是，今天70余年过去了，30多年来， 当中国大陆一次又一次的、一步又一步的推起了一个怀念民国的广阔社会思潮的时候，当中国大陆的青年今天的举着中华民国的国旗要求光复民国的时候，我以为日本国真正的道歉是在于了解中国大陆30余年民间历史反思的状况和成果。我以为是支持整个中国光复民国的这样一种历史愿望。如果日本朋友，如果美国朋友，如果在当年一切对中华民国有过欠缺的国际的友人们都能够了解中国大陆浩浩荡荡的反思民国的思潮，了解人民要光复民国的历史要求，我想，如果你们能支持他们，支持他们的这一历史愿望，支持他们对于自由民主的追求，那就是最好的道歉，那就是让我们能够看到未来中日关系的美好前景。我的话完了。
So it's very clear the subject of their apologies should be Mr. Chiang Kai-shek, who was a national hero, and should be the Nanjing and the Chongqing government led by the Nationalist Party, and especially should be Chinese people in mainland. For 70 plus years, this war happened 70 plus years ago. And for 30 plus years, we had been rethinking about the history of China. So if there's a movement in China about to rethinking about the nationalist China and about the Republic of China, and to restore the Republic of China, which has been the wish of many young Chinese people. So one of the results of Professor Endo's book is to show that if you really want to, if in the history you had done something harmful to the Chinese people, if you really want to apologize, or if you really want to help, you should support this movement. You should support the people of China to restore the Republic of China. And that applies both to my Japanese friends and my American friends, to support them, to show that which side you are on. That will bring a bright future between the peoples of Japan and China. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
谢谢。正好有批评啊。
Thank you, Xinhanyan, for your remarks and review of Dr. Endo's research. We have about 15 minutes for audience Q&A, and I will take my privilege as the moderator to ask the first two questions. The first is to Dr. Endo, and then the second question is to Xinhanyan. So the first question for Dr. Endo that I have is, what have been the critiques of your research, and what is your response to them? And if there are many critiques, perhaps choose one.
就是对您的这个工作有什么批判，有什么批评，然后的话，您的回应是什么？如果说有很多不同的意见的话呢，就是你捡一个最重要的来讲就可以
了。在日本的话，一般的日本人就认为我的书写的内容是对的，但是日本有不少的从中国大陆来的学者。他们是讲中国政府的，根据中国政府的那样的思想， 根据他们的思想来那个批判我的书，所以说这个内容是假的，或者是幻想什么什么的，有这样的情况。但是一般的日本人或者是其他的中国人的话，就不会有这样的情况的。
In Japan, most people thought my book was right. I was telling the truth. However, there were some visitors to Japan from mainland China who had the government, the official thinking. So they criticized my book as being false, being imaginary, but those were only a minority. Other people and the Japanese people, they don't think that way.
Not the visitor, the professor or scholar working in the University of Japan and
They were from mainland China.
from mainland China.
My apologies.
And Shinhan, in your opinion, how has the CCP's narrative of the Sino-Japanese War affected its domestic and foreign policy, in your opinion?
在您看来，就是中共的这个关于这个抗日战争的说法是如何影响它的国内和国际政策？
中共目前所提出的抗日战争的问题，他的观点很简单，就是抗日战争仍然是中共领导的，中共是抗日战争的中流砥柱。
The current insistence of the Communist Party is that the anti-Japanese war was led and was mainly fought by the Communist Party.
这是他对内的解释抗日战争的政策，目的是为了继续灌输、继续欺骗中共抗日、中共领导的抗日这样一个谎言。
That's their internal policy about the anti-Japanese war. The purpose of it is to brainwash, to deceive the Chinese people, to continue to tell them the lies.
对外，他一直宣传抗战是中国人打的，不分党派的，只要是中国人打的就行了。蓄意的抹杀中国国民党领导和坚持抗战的这样一个光荣的历史，抹杀中华民国伟大卫国战争究竟是谁打的、谁领导打的这样一个历史的事实。我这一句话是1993年中国人民解放军国防大学出版社出版的《国民党1937》这一本书里面的扉页上写的。他的全部的原话是：50年前那一场保卫了伟大民族血脉的战争，究竟是谁打的？谁领导打的？
To their foreign, toward the outside world, what they are trying to emphasize is that the anti-Japanese war was fought by the Chinese, and there was no emphasis about which party or parties played what roles. That the purpose of that is to deny the glorious history of fighting the Japanese by the nationalist party, by the Kuomintang party and the government and that party. This is not what I'm saying. This is what was said in the book published in 1993 by a Chinese military publishing house, which had asked for 50 years, now we need to know who led the fight of the Japanese in that war.
Thank you. And I'll open the floor to the audience. We have some mics running around. So if you have a question, just please state your name and where you're from, and then ask your question directed to a panelist. Sir.
Peixu from Washington, D.C. Let me ask in Chinese. 远藤教授，您发现的就是毛泽东在活着的时候从来没有举办过或参加过庆祝抗战胜利的活动。另外，你也从日本的这个方面得到的材料，确凿无疑的证实，潘汉年是共产党派去跟日军搞私下停火的一个人。我的问题是，您有了这样的发现之后，那些亲中共的或者亲北京的人有什么说法？ Yeah, let me put it, my question in English version. That is, you discovered that Mao, when he was alive, had never ever celebrated the so-called victory over Japanese aggression. And you also discovered that Pan Hannian, from the Japanese sources, that Pan Hannian is Chairman Mao's man to negotiate with the Japanese for a private ceasefire agreement between the Japanese invasion forces and the Communist Party. So my question is, what's the reaction from the pro-Beijing or from pro-Chinese Communist parties people? Thank you.
OK， 那么首先是那个关于这个为什么那个毛泽东时代呢没有举办那个任何抗日战争的那个胜利的那样的那个典礼，这个呢就是中国就是中共的那方说的意思是毛泽东太忙了，就忙不过去了，所以没办法。就有文革呀，有三反五反运动啦，或者是那个文革呀，有大跃进等等的，所以没有时间办这个的。是他们的说法是一个是这个。那么关于这个潘汉年和毛泽东的关系的话，是这么说的，先翻译一下。
Okay. First of all, about why Mao never celebrated the victory of the anti-Japanese war. What the Communist Party, the excuses given by the Communist Party was that Mao was very busy. Mao had been involved in the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, and the other movements.
OK， 那么关于这个第二个问题，就是潘汉年和毛泽东的这样的关系，就是说那个他们就是从大陆过来的那个当日本的大学的教授，跟他们那个一起，我参加过那个电视台的一个节目，2个小时的，那么他说。毛泽东的地位是这么高的，那么潘汉年的地位是这么低的，怎么能毛泽东直接向那个潘汉年命令这样的那个特务行为？不过在这个毛泽东年谱有明确的描述，这个是就是特别任务，那个有没有那个特别任务的？对，有这个特别任务，这特别的意思是 special， 然后任务是 mission or task obligation 等等的。那么所以这个特别任务的特和务，这个2个加起来特务就是 spy 的意思。但是在这个里明确的写到。毛泽东有一天叫潘汉年过来，就 face to face， 毛泽东命令了潘汉年，直接命令了潘汉年做这个特务工作，所以这个大陆学者的说的是没有根据的，他们是想象的。
About the Pan Hannian's part, there was an argument by some professors from mainland China we had a TV program, there was a debate about this. Their argument was that Mao was at a very high position and Pan was at a very low position. There's no way that Mao would directly order Pan to be an agent or a spy. But the book about the Mao's years, in Mao's years,
No.
actually had
Chronological list of Mao.
Okay, of Mao.
Yes.
Had shown the Mao actually had asked Pan Hanyan to come to his place and to had a face-to-face meeting with Pan Hanyan, and Pan Hanyan was given special missions or was becoming a special agent of Mao.
So Mao directly ordered Pan to do spy behavior. This is no doubt. This is accurate thing.
It's accurate. There's indisputable that the Pan did the special work for Mao.
Thank you. And my apologies. Are there any last questions in the audience by any chance? Excellent. Thank you for your cooperation because we are just about out of time. I think the discussion on the Sino-Japanese War is an important one, and it's mainly important sort of due to what Randy had talked about in the beginning of this talk. It's clearly history is important to the Chinese Communist Party as it exists today, but it's equally as important to look back and see how the Chinese Communist Party came to be, and especially, again, to recall and track how the party commemorates the Sino-Japanese War over time. And I hope that Dr. Endo's presentation, as well as Xin Hanian's presentation, help provide a new outlook to this war. So please help me in thanking our panelists. And we'll go right into our second panel. Just give us 1 minute to sort of set up, and then we'll start the next panel. Thank you very much. First, Dr. Michael is going to sit here. First person is Helen, then Michael, then Nadej. Huh?
You want to see that on the screen?
Not yet. He will be the second presenter.
Okay.
Oh, no, not at all. It's okay. You're more than welcome to sit there. Rachel, can one of it? Okay, thank you, everyone. If you can please find your seats. We're going to begin the second panel shortly. Okay, they're coming. They're coming. Hey. So the clicker for you is right here. When you start, just go left and right. Yes. And we're going to get some more wine. Thank you, everyone. Please find your seats.
Thank you all. We're going to go ahead and get started with the second panel. This panel is going to address some of the more practical current aspects of the Chinese Communist Party's manipulation of history and the present-day consequences in the context of how this impacts Chinese family life, how it operates to perpetuate Chinese rule in Tibet, how it shapes the CCP's foreign policy, and how it relates to the 1989 Tiananmen massacre, which has been effectively wiped from China's national memory. The bios of our speakers are all in your programs, so in the interest of time, I'm just going to go ahead and introduce them and have them go ahead and get started. And you can refer to your programs for their biographical information. So we're going to start with, is that right, with Helen, with Helen Raleigh. Yes, go ahead, please.
Let me get my back out your way. There you go.
Program.
Good afternoon. Before I share my experience with you, I want to first thank Randy and Rachel and Kelly and all the staff at the Project 2049 for your hard work and the courage to put on a Seeking Truth conference like this. I was born in China and finished my undergraduate degree before I come into the United States to pursue a graduate degree. So you can say I was a typical output of China's government-sanctioned education system. When I first came to the United States, even though I had doubts here and there about certain historical facts I was taught, but like all the immigrants, early immigrants came before me, I spent very little time to figure it out. Instead, I focused my time on better myself economically. My parents rarely mentioned what happened in the past, except in passing, they mentioned that our family had a genealogy book covered many, many generations, and it was destroyed in the Cultural Revolution. So the writer in me always wanted to write a family history book. A couple of years ago, both of my parents turned their 70s. I realized time is of the essence. I better get them start talking. What I learned from my parents was shockingly different from what I was taught in school. So I'm going to share with you two examples. The first historical event I'm going to share with you is the land reform. So the Chinese Communist Party pushed the land reform from 1950 to 1953. In our high school Chinese history book, there were only a few sentences about the land reform. But the movement was depicted as a popular and a necessary measure to redistribute properties back to the poor peasants. This notion was further reinforced by our Chinese literature class. One of the required literature reading in my school was an excerpt from a popular Chinese novel called The Hurricane, or in Chinese, it's called The 暴风骤雨, which was a novel written by a popular novelist called Zhou Libo. This novel supposedly presented the most realistic picture of the land reform, depicting how a group of righteous landless peasants beat back the sabotages of the landowners and successfully won land from the landowners. I especially remember the excerpt that we were required to memorize illustrated what a joyful event when the land was taken away from landowners and redistributed to poor peasants. This novel was so popular in China, it was later adapted into movie and stage play. One thing is worth noting is that in history, whether in history lessons or books or movies or any other entertainment forms, Even in children's nursery rhymes, landowners were always portrayed as the most evil and horrible human beings. I remember when I played jump ropes with my classmates, we used to chant about this popular rhyme, which is about a group of youth bravely beaten back a malevolent landowner who tried to steal chickens from the peasants. What I didn't know until a few years ago was I am a great-granddaughter of a landowner. My great-grandfather was a wheat farmer who owned some land prior to 1949. He sweated on every inch of that land to support his family. During the land reform, his relatives and poor neighbors didn't hesitate to take land and the farming animals away from him. So he lost all his property and turned into a penniless farmer overnight. My childhood chanting about the evil landowners must have been very hurtful to my parents. But my great-grandfather wasn't the only landowner who suffered during the land reform. Contrary to the popular description, the land reform was not a happy event. Over 10 million former landowners lost their property. Local villages were giving quotas about how many landowners had to be identified, denounced, and even executed. Even landowners' families were not spared. It is estimated that the total number of landowners and their families who lost their lives was between 1 to 2 million. The so-called land reform was nothing more than a calculated terror in the name of wealth redistribution. Eventually, the poor peasants in China didn't come out as the winners either. Through a series of agriculture collectivization movement, the land that was handed out to poor peasants years earlier eventually all returned to the state. So by 1958, there were no private land ownership left in China. Of course, such truths will never be found in high school history books, or Chinese literature books, or any other entertainment forms. The second example I'm going to share with you is the Great Chinese Famine from 1959 to 1961. Like the land reform, there were only a few sentences in our history book that touched on the famine. The famine was referred to either as 3 years of natural disaster or 3 years of difficulties. So the government blamed the weather, and nowhere in the history book did it mention how many people died during the famine. And unlike the land reform, there was no officially sanctioned books, movies, or any other entertainment portray what really happened during the famine. Through my parents, I learned that I had a baby uncle who was born in 1959 and died in my grandma's arms because of starvation. My dad also lost his maternal grandmother, 2 uncles, 1 aunt and her family of 5, and one of his high school teachers. In Frank Decoter's well-researched book, Mao's Great Famine, he presented the data to show, first, China had a great harvest in 1958, the year before the famine started. Second, weather was very mild between 1959 to 1961. There was some drought in some parts of the country, but none was severe enough to cause such huge loss of lives in any normal circumstance. So China's famine was not a natural disaster. It was a man-made atrocity. Official archives about the famine are still largely sealed, and most people cannot access to it. We can only estimate the death toll of the famine even till today. The death toll is estimated between 30 to 60 million. To understand the scale of this atrocity, it's important to know that the estimated death toll of the Second World War was about 60 million. So Mao inflicted human suffering in one country in 3 years, equivalent to that of the entirety of the Second World War. Learning the truth of these historical events, especially my own family's suffering, has been a watershed event for myself. My first book, Confucius Never Said, is a very different book than I initially envisioned. It still covers family history, but I also tried to give many voiceless Chinese who never make it today. I have since become very vocal against socialism through my public speakings and writings. Socialism clearly failed China, and China's Communist Party has gradually shifted away from it. The last 3 decades of economic boom has transferred China into an economic house and produced a new wave of nationalism among the Chinese people. While suppressing the truth of its own historical records, the CCP quickly tapped into this newfound nationalism to fill the ideological vacuum. Through government-sanctioned education and propagandas, it appeals to nationalism by blaming the West for trying to constrain China's unavoidable rising. It is evident that the failure to learn from the past is shaping China's future. There is a famous Chinese phrase, 祸起萧墙, which means the worst threat or danger usually comes from within. What's truly threatening China's peaceful rising has less to do with external forces and more to do with internal conflict. The CCP's reliance on using nationalism as a diversion to domestic issues is like playing a game of riding a tiger, which is a dangerous game because it could easily get out of control. Last, I want to leave you this quote from Frederick Douglass. He once said, "The life of the nation is secure only while the nation is honest, truthful, and virtuous. The rest of the world can and will embrace a peacefully rising China when China can face its own recent history in the most honest and candid way." Thank you.
Thank you, Hal. Michael Davis will be next.
Oh, that's good.
Congratulations on your promotion to movie star.
She's picked up on your name. I want to thank the host for bringing me back to the Tibet issue. As you might imagine, in Hong Kong, we've been preoccupied for the last couple years with things going on there. Although I did have an opportunity to spend the fall term in India and enjoyed another meeting with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, I haven't been able to write on Tibet in the last couple of years, so I appreciate the chance to revisit Tibet. I just started with a couple maps in these slides so we can see sort of the scale of real estate, if nothing else, that's implicated by China's disputes with its peripheral nations in Tibet and the Uyghurs and Xinjiang and Inner Mongolia. And if you realize most of that gap in the middle between Qinghai and Gansu, much of it is also filled with what China calls national minorities in Yunnan, then you see a good part of China is at stake. And this is one of the reasons I think the problem has been so sticky over the years and disputes have arisen. Here's just another map showing those regions where Tibetans live in what is modern China. I just, in 10 minutes, one can't say a lot about this. The Tibet problem, there's a historical problem, a historical perspective on it. There are a number of perspectives. And I think historically we've been arguing, that is the argument itself, has been over autonomy, human rights, and so on. I think there's an international perspective. I think a lot of the world outside sees China's rise through the lens of Tibet, among many other things. That how China has treated what used to be one of its neighbors doesn't bode well for countries in Southeast Asia and elsewhere worrying about China's rise today. But China, and as the conference we have today suggests, refuses to acknowledge a lot of these problems and relies a great deal on history in dealing with it. Now, in my talk, if time permits, I'll try to get into, first I want to talk about the 2008 uprising and its aftermath, because I think that really brings us to the historical topic, which is the second here on the 4 topics listed. And then we'll see if we can take a moment to look at international practices and perhaps policies that come from that. If we look back at 2008, most of you in this room, I didn't know what my audience would be, so I have a slide here just to remind us. We know that there was the Olympics coming up, there was a lot of Tibetan protest, and the Chinese were trying to basically put out the fire and sort of make things go well for them leading up to the Olympics. So that's sort of where we were in 2008. I personally was in Dharamsala when a lot of these events unfolded, and it was interesting because there was all this blaming of the people in Dharamsala for the uprising. But if those people were causing an uprising, then they're the best poker players I ever met. I was actually attending their parliamentary sessions, and all they could talk about was the budget. And I swear to God, they sounded more like a legislature in Virginia than people who were orchestrating rebellion. So, maybe they were good poker players. There was something going on behind the scenes, who knows? But I doubt it. And then we know these meetings took place. Talks, we're told, that were about the Dalai Lama's personal future, not China-Tibet negotiations. Think about this. This itself is false. Obviously, they don't care about the Dalai Lama's personal future. That ultimately, these discussions, whatever they may be, have to be these something more than that. The Dalai Lama, of course, we're told that he's criticized, these words are used to describe him. And then 3 stops, the Tibetans are supposed to stop activities aimed at splitting China, stop plotting and inciting violence, and stop disrupting the Beijing Games. In July, China actually requested Tibetans to outline their position, and we know they did. They wrote it into this memorandum. Now, I was there giving workshops in the summer before they wrote this memorandum. So I kind of know what kinds of discussions were going on, although I've been accused of having my fingerprints on the memorandum. They're not there. I wasn't in any way writing the memorandum. But we did hold a workshop, and we talked about, in 2007, there was a UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it's actually, that was a big discussion and something all the parliamentarians were quite interested in. And it's interesting, in this memorandum, for the first time, they used the word indigenous to describe Tibetans. And that's a tricky move, because they were a little afraid of using it because, does that make us like North American indigenous people who never see the sunlight, who never gain back their sovereignty? But at the same time, the Dalai Lama's policies are sort of middle way, are consistent with the idea in the UN Declaration that these peoples should have the right to self-determination and have these kinds of rights that they actually wrote into the memorandum. So I think people here will be familiar with it, so I sort of move on. And the Chinese response, and this is interesting again, because this is again a kind of false thing. They says genuine autonomy the Tibetans asked for equals a high degree of autonomy, and a high degree of autonomy is covert independence. Duh. Hong Kong is promised a high degree of autonomy. So are they promising Hong Kong independence? So, I mean, the way words are used here is interesting, that, and everyone who's here probably knows, there's some relationship between the historical agreement that Tibetans had in 1951 and the Hong Kong model and so on. So it's interesting that suddenly what Hong Kong has promised is called covert independence, accuse the Tibetans of colluding with democracy activists and so on, that the effort to control migration into Tibet is ethnic cleansing. Again, truth is an issue here. And then they declare we never discussed the so-called Tibet issue and effectively never will, and that when they, quote unquote, liberated Tibet, that was a sort of, to be celebrated as Serf Emancipation Day. We know since then there's been a much more occupation in Tibet, much more repression in the recent years. And of course, China approaches Tibet as a security concern. So this gets us to history. Now, I had an interview a decade ago with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and he said all Chinese government ever wants to talk about is history. To be honest with you, that's the problem. When you look at the middle way approach, you look at the Tibetan memorandum, it's not declaring independence. In fact, many Tibetans might be unhappy with it because it concedes a great deal to China. In fact, the memorandum, in my opinion, went almost too far because it almost concedes the same form of government as long as Tibet somehow gets some of these other things that are promised. So it's not independence, but the reason it's never accepted is history. And the Dalai Lama, when I had a chance to interview him, emphasized that. He says, they always want to talk about history, and I don't want to talk about history because we'll never agree on history. The Chinese government simply doesn't like that the Dalai Lama, recognizing the power differential, is indicated a willingness to live under Chinese rule with some high degree of autonomy or genuine autonomy, but not acknowledging the legitimacy of it. That's where the history comes in. And when I looked at this, and I'm not a historian by any estimate, but I think my understanding of it was that actually when it comes to the facts of history, Sino-Tibetan history, they actually agree on a lot of the facts. What I find interesting is it's the interpretation of the facts that gets to be the problem. You know, a lot of that history is written in the history books of both countries over time, and these events took place. But how they interpret them. For example, if the Dalai Lama visits the Beijing or the national capital, wherever it is, and he goes there, is he going there to, bow to the emperor and acknowledge his sovereignty? Or is he just going there because of some kind of diplomatic relationship? How is that understood? And I think that has been the crux of the matter. History has been at the center, I think, of the inability to agree on things. And how they interpret these events is the issue. Beijing, of course, describes Tibet as an inseparable part of China. Since ancient times, they claim Tibetan submission to the Mongol Empire in 1247. Interesting fact here, submitted to the Mongols in 1247, that's not disputed. At that time, the Dalai Lama was weak and the Mongol rising power, and they submitted. Not disputed, but it's interesting, the Yuan dynasty doesn't come into existence until 1270. So the Tibetans were part of the Yuan dynasty, as part of the Mongol Empire when it took over China, so maybe Tibet should be asking for China back, because they were part of the ruling elites. They had very close relationship with the Mongols, okay? So the historical events, and no one really disputes it, but who's subordinate to who, and if you look at the historical writings, you'll see all these great cautions when the Dalai Lama comes, one case where he wanted to go to Beijing. He wanted the emperor to go out of town to meet him, and they agreed on that. But then that never quite happened. So he wound up making the emperor at least get off the throne and walk to see the Dalai Lama. So how do these people interpret these events? And their consciousness of the events, again, I think is quite distinct. Here's just a very overview of interpretations. Tibetans describe their relationship with the Yuan emperor as a Choyan relationship. The Ming, during the Ming, I think most historians agree that the Ming wasn't particularly into Tibetan Buddhism, but viewed them more as an intermediary with the Mongols. In the Qing, China did send the military in occasionally to occupy Tibet. But what's interesting to me is they never actually directly ruled Tibet, not until after 1950. Even when they had the power to go to Lhasa and to occupy for a short period of time, they never tried to directly rule Tibet. So if it's autonomy, it shouldn't be direct rule. I mean, if they're even trying to copy their historical record, then direct rule would not be justified. Of course, during most of this history, they didn't rule Tibet at all. So that raises the question of independence. But at least if the Dalai Lama is conceding and the goal is to sort of copy their historical relationship in some form, then what should that look like? The 17-point agreement, in some sense, understood there was no direct rule and that they had always ruled Tibet in an indirect, when they did rule it, and again, very short periods of time, in a very indirect sort of way. And this is kind of the relationship China had with Vietnam, with Korea, and with most of the surrounding countries. So it's that I think gets to where the Dalai Lama's interpretation is at. You see him here leaving when the Chinese government, one can understand China had a revolution, the communists won, and they were full of themselves at the time, and there was no way they were going to treat the Tibetans nicely. And the Dalai Lama soon discovered this, and we know what happened. I would say, and I'm not going to have time because I got 2-minute warning, I would say all of these policies they now have, many of you will be familiar with their national minority laws and so on, they're all false. There is no autonomy, and all of these guarantees of autonomy in all of these areas does not exist. So that's also, this is now history as well. And the Communist Party's method of rule, I think, is even more extreme, that falsity, liberation, democratic reform, all these words are used to describe what's going on. And you can see it here. The time is out, so I won't go into it in great detail. I only want to say, when it comes to autonomy, international law has never been kind to autonomy. It's mostly protected by constitutions, occasionally in treaties. But the one thing that's interesting, and I think what drove that Tibetan memorandum, is this, the UN Declaration in 2007, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it, in many ways, looks like what the Tibetan memorandum looks like. And I do advise diplomatic representatives from time to time, and the Tibetan government in exile, I give workshops there, I would use that memorandum. And if there's anybody from the State Department, read the memorandum. I think that's the most useful tool in dealing with this, and thank you again.
Thank you, Professor David. Now, I'm going to turn to Nadej Roland.
Well, I wanted to start by thanking the organizers. I'm very...
Here, Nadej.
Oh, this one, sorry.
I don't think that one's for.
Okay. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was asked to have a more international perspective on the historical narratives and its impact on China's rise, and in particular in the context of the competition between the US and China. So I'm going to have 2 points. First, why are historical narratives important to China? And second, how those narratives have evolved, especially since Xi Jinping came to power. So why are historical narratives important for China? I think by now all of you would have realized why. And I would like to underline that no modern nation is really exempt from trying to shape historical narratives, and China is no exception. They're closely related to how a country portrays themselves, both domestically and internationally. And they are mainly used for a political purpose, which is generally nation building and cohesion. But for a one-party state like China, creating and controlling the narrative has mainly been about unity around the party itself and serving the party's ultimate goal, which is, as you know, maintaining its monopoly on power. So China's own reading of history has evolved over the years, and especially since Tiananmen, when the CCP tried to compensate its lack of legitimacy by elevating its role in the defeating the Japanese militarism. And this anti-Japanese component of China's nationalism is still very much the focus of China's narrative, but it's also evolved in the past few years, and I would say in 2 ways. First of all, the timeline has been extended far back in China's history, before World War II and even before the century of humiliation. And second of all, it's not just for domestic purposes anymore, but it now has a very strong external dimension. So let me elaborate on those 2 points. First of all, the historical narrative supports the nationalistic discourse, which has 2 faces, one of shame and the other one of pride. For a long time, it was the shameful face that was the focus of China's narrative. It wanted to expunge the concessions that were forced upon the Chinese during the century of humiliation and demanded respect from the West, which now includes mainly the US and its allies, but back then China's aggressors were mainly France, my country, Britain, Russia, Japan, and Germany. But today, China's nationalism also has a proud face, of which we were given a sample during the opening ceremony of the 2008 Olympic Games. It promotes the party's achievements in bringing prosperity and strength to the country, and it boasts national aspirations for grandeur. In a nutshell, it's Xi Jinping's China dream, a dream that calls for the revival or the renaissance of an almost mythical China with an unbroken history of 5,000 years, and conjures up a blend of historical, glorious past, summons hazy collective memories of ancient times when China enjoyed a flourishing civilization, when it was at the leading edge of innovation, and when its cultural influence reached out all the way to Europe. And this sort of nostalgia for imperial greatness is relayed by the TV and media in China. And Mao must be rolling over in his grave, not just because of what he's been listening to today, but also because all the four olds that were defined as poisoning the minds of the people are now back in the front burner. So my second point about China's narrative that's getting an international dimension. The party portrays itself as the paramount patriotic element in the nation, the force which fought and won against foreign forces, which humiliated China before 1949. It has been a constant since the establishment of the PRC under Hu Jintao, and even more now with Xi Jinping. The party put this past experience of humiliation in contrast with what is going on today. The party is now working hard for China and China's national interests to be respected globally, and it won't accept to be bullied anymore. So how does this have an impact on China's international posture? If China will not be bullied like in the past, then it means it will not accept any compromise on its core national interests. And you can see a few examples on how they want to achieve that. Military modernization, more aggressive and assertive posture in the maritime domain in Asia. And the narrative also presents China's history as having created a set of conditions or circumstances that are unique to China. And in this very specific Chinese context, only the CCP leadership was able to maintain stability. And therefore, the people should be grateful about the fact that they are out of poverty. And this achievement that has shows that the party has always chosen the right path for China's development. Even if the leadership made mistakes in the part, its general direction was and still is the right one. So this has two implications, both domestic and international. Domestically, the Chinese people should continue to support the CCP leadership and recognize that any desire for alternative government would lead to chaos. And internationally, it's implicit that if China's own path of development is the right one, then there's no room for any alternative government. And therefore, this discredits Western ideas, norms, institutions, and as a result, intensifies the ideological rift between the Chinese model of development and a more liberal or democratic model. Third, there's the China dream of the great rejuvenation of the nation, which give the main direction to China's great power ambitions. It goes together with the idea that the US unipolar moment is over and that now power is shifting inevitably from the West to the East. And the term rejuvenation itself encapsulates a vision of a China that will somehow go back to a past golden age when China was the dominant power in Asia at the center of the civilized world and its diplomatic exchanges based on the tributary system. So the party would correct the historical injustice made to China in the past, and now will give back its rightful place at the center of a renewed international order. History doesn't repeat itself, as we may know, and I can understand why people could be skeptical about the whole idea of a 21st century version of the tributary system. And yet, if you look close enough, you will find in Xi Jinping's official speeches some core elements of this tributary system concept, such as harmony between all people under heaven. This is particularly true of the discourse related to the One Belt, One Road initiative. OBOR is, for example, portrayed as an inclusive endeavor. It's also said to be respecting diversity and plurality so that there exists harmony with difference. And this, as you know, is a Confucian concept that's now revamped and presented as a principle according to which countries should construct harmonious relations with one another while maintaining differences in views, and I think that's very important. But it seems to me that if China is at the center of a renewed regional order, embodied by the new concept of an Asian community of common destiny, then it means that the US are excluded from the picture. And it is implied that the geopolitical competition with the US is going to continue and being inevitable. In conclusion, I would say that historical narratives are as much about the future as they are about the past, and about how a given country projects itself outside its own borders. And looking at China, they give us a sense of what China wants for its own rise. Even if the vision is not yet fully formed, the narratives refer to a time when China was the regional hegemon, when the international system was hierarchical, when the system valued order over freedom and elite governance over democracy and human rights. And so this, I think, gives us a sense of where the CCP wants to go, and I think that we should pay attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. So our next and final speaker will be Professor Roeneha, and I believe she had requested that her remarks not be recorded. Is that correct? This has been an incredibly rich panel. I don't think we could ask for a more diverse and interesting discussion about China's war on history, such as it is. And we do have, fortunately, a little bit of time left for questions and answers. And so I'm going to use the prerogative of the chair and ask my question of all of the panel. Based on your own experience, both in studying how the Chinese Communist Party manipulates history, what can, and your experience living in free countries and free societies, what do you think are some of the things that we in free societies, both as society and as policymakers, can do to inoculate ourselves against this as it's being pushed out into the world by the CCP? How can we help to ensure that the distortions of history don't impact our own internal democratic arrangements as well as our engagement in the world? And I'll give you one of the examples. You talk about, Michael, how in the region, this concern about the reemergence of a tributary type system, and I hear this all the time in Burma from Burmese people, that they don't want to be like Tibet. They don't want what happened in Tibet to happen to them in Burma, and they're very concerned about how political warfare operations in Burma are impacting on their attempt to transition to a democracy. So it is especially a problem for, I think, weak and emerging democracies, but even in the United States and in European and Japan and more established democracies, there's still this, this problem is still present for us. And how would you, if you could, if you had 5 minutes with the president's national security advisors, what would you say about this issue for countries like ours? And anybody can jump ahead. We can go down the road. However you want to go ahead.
Well, I have to say I'm somewhat cynical, and Professor Endo's point, I think, was that there was a point at least made in the panel that if people knew the truth, then things would change and they'd do something about it. I doubt it. I think the Communist Party is so good at inventing a world of constructed truth. And I fear our defense against it is even worse. All you have to do is watch the evening news and the fact checker reports on our own politicians. And you realize that maybe in this internet age, where basically we all hive off into groups that we agree with, and we share information through the internet, and there are news networks that we agree with, and people who agree with them watch them 24/7, and people who don't watch another network. So I think we're not intellectually and situationally very well placed to offer a resistance to constructed truth. That's the reality of our age. The only thing I can think that resists it is interest. If somehow we position people's interest in a way to offer resistance to something or to favor values that we share, I can't be a very good ideologue because I kind of like that everybody's at each other and that no one wins. So that's kind of what I believe. I mean, I'm a constitutional scholar, so I want to set the game so that nobody can dominate. That's sort of where I'm at. And in fact, that's why I'm going to spend this year at the National Endowment to look at social movements and democracy, to try to understand how people can construct the game favorable to their value system. But when it comes to resisting China, its version of reality, or whether truth matters, if they know it. I mean, that we're told 47 million people were killed by the Communist Party, or at least suffered unnatural deaths in the 1950s and 60s. And I think most people know that probably by now. Yeah, in the 70s as well. And they know it by now, but 85% in opinion polls supporting the Communist Party. Well, why? Interest, current interest. So I hate to be the cynic here, but that's...
Well, John Adams said, facts are those the stubborn things. So I guess I am a little more ideological. I think, sometimes, by the way, this is going to be the only time I will quote Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin once said, one death is a tragedy and a million deaths is just statistics. So I think the truth is important, but it's important how the truth and facts are related to to your personal level. And to me, as I mentioned earlier, that it's through discovery of my own personal family sufferings which changed me. I think for many young people today, they were never really taught in China, like you said, fabricated truths. And then when they came here, they had all the access to the free information, but nobody there to guide them to discover, to see what are the information is actually true versus what are the further fabrications. So I think we do have a moral responsibility for all of us who consider we know the truth or discover the truth through our own past to share that information in forums like this and more like this. I wish there's only standing room only where all these other people not here. So that's one thing. And my second point is I also echo what Ravana just mentioned, that I think U.S. government and European government need to have stand up, need to protect people, especially people who came from China or Chinese citizens who took the courage to speak the truth, because we are worried about our families. We are worried about people we leave behind. So it is important for the government of West do not sacrifice our families and our right to speak the truth in exchange for short-term economic gains. I see that happen again and again. That's very frustrating because you lose your credibility when on the one hand you say, I'm standing for all these principles, but on the other hand, I'm willing to trade anytime with a dictator just because there's short-term economic interest can override those things. When you do that, you lose the credibility. Then why should we take the sacrifice? All these recent citizens who make a public confession on CCTV, they all have dual citizenship, or they have citizenship from another country, but their government didn't stand up for them. So they were arrested, they were picked up from Hong Kong or even in Thailand, then were making forced confessions on TV. Where's the government? There are sworn-in citizens of another country. So to me, that is very, very disappointing. We have to do both. If you ask people like us to speak the truth, you have to be there to protect us.
I cannot say anything after. I think everything was perfect. We need to do our job as spreading knowledge, and we need to do our job as defending our own values. I think that sums it up.
I still think that it's important and useful. I agree with Michael. Sometimes I lost sight and I feel discouraged and disappointed too. But I'm a short-term pessimistic and long-term optimistic, because if you look at all the changes happening in the world, Arab Spring, Tunisia, Egypt, everything. The day before it happened, people would be telling you it's impossible for any changes. And the day after it happened, everyone on the street would say that's inevitable. As a historian, I saw that again and again, and I just have to have faith not in the CCP, but in history and in humanity, that history has to progress, and this is going to change. So that's one thing. And second thing, I think my idol, Havel from the Czech Republic, he said it very well. It's true that even if you do everything, nothing will change. But one thing we know for sure is if you don't do anything, nothing will change. So rather than sitting there, I think it's important that we do something. And as for the policy makers, I of course I appreciate all the pressure from political interest, and you have to answer to your voters in media needs, and all those are just understandable. And I feel I'm so glad I'm not in those positions because it's so hard. But at the same time, I also hope that not just the policy makers, but we should all remind ourselves why we are strong. What makes this country strong is not because of the money, it's not because of the military, but because of those values for liberty, those universal values that inspire us to take to the street in 1989. And don't let us down. Those are the values that you are strong, and those are the values that all we as human beings are longing for and fighting for, the justice. And Tiananmen may remind us of repression, but also Tiananmen represents that. Look at that tank man. That's the power of the powerless. As the desire for freedoms is so deeply human, and the longing for freedom and rights is just a universal. I'm sure history will witness that Tiananmen spirit as the power of the powerless again and again. So I'm not giving up. I'm not giving up yet. I'm still working. And finally. We live in a global village. We are not doing this for those dumb Chinese like me who just blah, blah, blah. I'm just teasing. But we are doing this for ourselves too, because now we live in a global village. It's like you're on the same plane if you're being hijacked, whether you got a first class seat or got a window seat, everyone is ending to the same place. So we need to defend these values that make us proud. Thank you very much.
I'm going to open it up. We have a few minutes, so if you are interested in asking a question, raise your hand and the microphone will come around. I'm going to collect 2 questions at a time. So Russell and
Great. Thank you, Kelly. I'll keep my question really brief. And Russell Shell with Global Taiwan Institute. And so naturally, my question will be about Taiwan. So, and this is open to all the speakers, and that is, what is Taiwan's role in the narrative for China's future? I think we talked a lot about China's past, how the CCP manipulated Chinese history. And so naturally, as a Chinese-speaking democracy, what is Taiwan's role in the narrative for China's future? Thank you.
Okay. And Professor, you're next. Russell's handing you the microphone. Sorry.
戴维斯先生，我很感谢你对中国历史上西藏和汉民族的关系做了一个很好的讲解。
Can you microphone, please? Just for the web, thanks.
非常感谢你对汉民族和藏民族的关系做了一个历史的讲演，非常尊重。但是我也有一个问题和一个看法提供给你。我的问题是，在1950年之前，中华民国在中国执政的38年间，中国是内忧外患，可是从来没有出现过像现在这样的，或者根本没有出现过像现在这样的要求分裂和独立的要求。这是一个问题。第二个，我有个看法，我简单的提供给你。你在讲到元代原统治者和汉族和藏族的关系的时候，在讲到清代和汉族和藏族的关系的时候，我以为不是说得很清楚。特别是你说1950年之前西藏从来都是独立的，这是相当不正确的。因为在20世纪初，英国和俄国的一个协定，西藏是遵守的。这个协定明确地指明了西藏是属于中国的，并且说明了中国是西藏的宗主国，这是一。第二个，在达赖喇嘛14于30年代着床的时候，西藏政府邀请了中华民国的特使代表吴忠信先生，并且把他放在最高的位置上，以至于把英国的代表弃了出去。第三个，在抗日战争年代，不仅很多藏人参加了中华民国的卫国战争，而且西藏政府捐助200万两黄金给中华民国重庆政府买飞机打日本军队。我想这些例子说明，1950年之前，西藏是承认中华民国的，是承认当时的中国政府的。所以我认为这是不够正确的。我仅仅提供你参考。我希望你相信我，我是一个坚持了30余年反共而从未退却过的一个反共学者。我不是今天中国共产党的同路人。谢谢。
Brief translation.
Thank you, Professor Davis, for your presentation on the relationship between China and Tibet. And I have a question and a comment. The question is,
get the question?
The question is that before 1950, was Tibet really independent from China? My understanding is that Tibet was China was the suzerain, that's the word, right, of Tibet.
Okay, and
I can answer both
Okay,
questions.
both questions. All
Okay.
right. Thank you,
Yeah.
Professor Davis.
I can't answer the first question. There's no perfect answer to it, but I can offer a comment. In Hong Kong, we face the same question you face. What role can we play in China's development and in particular political reform? My sense is, quite frankly, that the best role is for Taiwan to run its democracy and give an example of the alternative. And I know, because my classes are full of mainland students, they're very much conscious nowadays of Taiwan. What I have to say to Rowena is that the students in engineering and all the sciences are the most nationalistic, but the students I get in social science and law, they basically have two truths. One truth they have to live with to get a job and live in China, and the other truth is what they believe, the real truth that you would like. And so I think Taiwan is a source of information and understanding, and I think that's very important. I've done several meetings with people involved in sunflower movements and everything. We compare that with umbrella movements and so on. So I think that vigorous debate between Hong Kong and Taiwan is very important. And it actually goes to the mainland today too, because Taiwan professors and others. So I think there's a lot of intellectual exchange. And I think performance is the better way to win in these kinds of arguments in the face of repression and so on. So anyhow, and I think Taiwan is doing pretty good at that. On the Tibet question, there was, I left out of my presentation because of time, there was a negotiation between the British and the Chinese government, the Kuomintang government, at Simla in India. And the discussion in India reached an interesting solution that they would have inner and outer Tibet, which, well, of course, we know happened to Mongolia as well, inner Mongolia and outer Mongolia, the outer being a separate country. I think a lot of this notion of suzerainty was a British creation. I think they were just trying to create a concept to try to explain something they really didn't know. I don't think they really had a full grip on the history of Tibet and China. And so I think that's just an explanation. They know that China has this tributary system, and they know that Tibet has a long relationship with China, but I don't think they knew really the nature of it fully. And so they invented this intermediate term between sovereignty and being a part of a country, and they called it suzerainty. But if this Simla agreement had been reached, then what is called the TAR today would have been like Mongolia today, a separate country. And the agreement actually failed not over that. It didn't fail over that. It failed over a dispute between the boundary of inner and outer Tibet. That's where the agreement collapsed, and it was rejected when it was taken home. Yeah.
Okay, we are pretty, did you have to add? Yes, please go ahead.
Just one quick comment about what Taiwan can do for China. I think the fact that you have democracy already proved that the CCP's argument that democracy is unfit for the Chinese society is wrong.
Yeah. So quickly, 2 short questions, and then we'll have to wrap it up. Yes, go ahead. This gentleman, and then the gentleman behind him.
A very quick question. That is, these days, China actually regulates free speech worldwide. If you say something that to the Chinese dislike, the Chinese Beijing dislike, they can block you, or they can stage a cyber attack that you simply cannot resist. So what can we do about it?
Okay. The gentleman behind you.
I have a question for Mr. Davis. I just spent my summer doing research in Tibet on the education achievement gap between different ethnic groups. And according to my observations, like in Tibet, they now have a free 15-year education from preschool to senior high school, and university is largely free. So, and they also offer classes in both Mandarin and Tibetan language. What do you think that will have a long-term impact in like Tibetan nationalism, and can you offer your own observations in Dharamsala about the education offered by Dalai Lama's government? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions, and I'm just going to
Can I just jump in with the internet thing?
Absolutely.
Well, actually, that's a very timely question because according to the Obama administration, as at the end of October, they're going to give up the U.S. government ownership of the internet, the icon. So the Senator Cruz actually have a bill out there that to prevent that happening. To me, that is very, very important in terms of the cyber warfare. That it is important because in the United States, even though the government has maintained control of the internet, but you basically leave it hands-free. That's why we have a free internet. Anybody can start a company, start a cyber shop, and see whatever you want. And so it's very important. I hope his bill, Senator Cruz's bill, will pass that the United States will not relinquish the U.S. control of ICANN. I think that's the best alternative for the internet.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think that it's just, this is a war in the internet, in a sense. China has mastered the art of controlling the internet better than any country on earth. A lot of authoritarian regimes want to send their young people to China to learn how to suppress the press and suppress speech. I often thought that I teach human rights. If I were cynical, I could teach a course on how to suppress the press in Asia. It's like there's so many tricks up their sleeve. I personally am attacked in the Beijing blogosphere and everything, so I kind of know when the people attack me, sometimes I find they even rewrite the old attack. It's, so you know that it's coming from some government person who's, 50 Cent or somebody who knows exactly how to attack and revise the attack based on something else. So I don't think there's a way to do it. It's just, like I said, I actually agree with all that was said in the first question, that we have to resist it. I spent most of my life doing that, as people who invited me know. And it's the value system we have, and we have to make sure we keep information flowing. I think that's all we can do. China's going to do what it wants to do. Russia's going to do what it wants to do, and we have to respond to it. When it comes to education, I think the problem that China has in Tibet is that they think, and maybe that's a communist disease, they think that it's all about economics. So if you make people's life better, then they'll stop resisting you. But the problem is, it's actually almost the opposite. When people's life get better, then they start resisting you, because then America has had to learn this as well in its foreign policy, that then they're more able to resist you and so on. So I think there's a battle for the hearts and minds of young people in Tibet. And there's worry that too much Mandarin and too little Tibetan, economically, young Tibetans are better off when they learn Chinese because they can get jobs and so on. So I think this is understood in Dharamsala, but I don't think anyone has a solution to it, as far as I know. But yeah, you're right. This has been a battleground. Yeah.
Ladies, anything to add? Okay, well then I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up since we are running a little behind, but I want to thank all of our panelists from the first panel and from this panel. I'm going to, I guess, misquote Stalin and say that, or I think it was Stalin who used to say that the present and the future are known, but the past is always in question. And I think that this panel and this whole discussion today has helped us to at least answer some questions, I hope, and maybe raise more about where we go from here. So thank you all for joining us, and also those online. And I just want to give a great round of applause to our panel for coming and sharing their thoughts and wisdom with us today. Thank you.